a British soldier should be doing. No matter how fucked up the training I'd been through, we were taught that we were going to kill the enemy, engage the enemy. But what I thought we were doing in Iraq, or what I could see we were doing in Iraq, was engaging civilians, terrorising civilians. So I thought about this every day at length, and at the end of every day I got to the same conclusion: I can't do this. I can't carry on doing this. So at the end of the week, I decided that I'd better go and get an interview with my CO. I walked into the admin office. There was a clerk there, corporal, I think. I said, "All right, mate." I said, "I need an interview with the CO." And he said, "Is this about leaving?" And I was kind of shocked by that. I said, "Well, can you read my brain or something? You know, how'd you guess that?" Anyway, I said, "Yeah, it is. I suppose it is." And over the next few weeks, I went through a series of interviews. I was interviewed by that same CO who had said he was worried about me becoming a secret police of Baghdad. I was interviewed by a guy who used to be my OC when I was in the parachute regiment. I was interviewed by guys who'd done 20 odd years, an RSM. And, okay, so they didn't agree with what I was doing, but also they didn't try and change my mind, and they didn't outright disagree with what I was saying. Because I was so sort of scared about what I was doing, you know, it was like going to see the headmaster times 100. I stuck to two very simple points. I thought, right, I've got to stick to two things that I can defend. And those two things were, I'm not going back to Iraq, and I'm not working under American command. And I just stuck to that. And at first people thought I was trying to get out of the military so I could pick up a cushy job with the private contractors working out there. But over these interviews, these long interviews, I think people worked out that actually this was a genuine objection to what we were involved in Iraq, and to the whole mission, not just to what we were doing, but to the whole sort of enterprise. But there was one officer who was highly critical of me, who called me a coward. And that was the Padre, the Christian minister. And he told me that on the way down to the Falklands there were other people like me who were scared. You know, other people like me who didn't want to get killed. And I was trying to explain to him that actually, when you're sneaking up on someone's house during a curfew at 2 o'clock in the morning with 30 other armed guys, you know, with a bag full of explosives, there's not much to be scared of. If anyone's going to be scared, it should be them. You know, he just kind of ignored that. And he was highly dismissive of me, but it wasn't until a long time afterwards, speaking to other guys who'd been through a similar process, and they've all said, yeah, it was the Padre who gave me a hard time, which is kind of hard to sort of reconcile, you know, with that whole Christianity. But you only need to look at their cat badge to understand the Padre. Through God conquer. I think that's a bit more Old Testament, you know. Anyway, so within a few weeks, I was out of the military. Didn't really know what to do with myself. Didn't expect to be out of the military. Still considered myself a soldier, but had no intention of working in Iraq or Afghanistan. When I left, I was given a book, security companies to work for. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't qualified for anything. I started working for these security firms in London. That came to a quick end. I was given a job to sit in a shareholder meeting for Shell. There's a much bigger room than this. All the board were up here. And we were told to wear suits and pretend to be shareholders. But there was another group of people in there who were also pretending to be shareholders. And that was Friends of the Earth. Now, I didn't realise this beforehand. So as the morning was going on, these people kept on standing up and they were saying, I'm from Sakhalin. And I'm going to get this wrong now, but I'm just trying to sort of tell the story. I'm from Sakhalin, and the bay there, the fish, they're all dead, they're all floating on the water. What are you going to do about that? And, you know, the board just moved on with their latest profit figures. And then someone else was standing up and goes, I'm from Texas, you know. I thought, oh, he's probably got some positive things to say about the oil industry. And he's talking about the poisonous fumes that were in his town. People from Nigeria with the oil running through the streets. And I was sat there, I forgot that I was supposed to be the security man. And I was kind of like nodding away to these people thinking, yeah, he's got a good point. Yeah. And it got to lunchtime and then all these people stood up and they took all their tops off. And it said something about Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Nigerian poet. And they all started singing this song and I was thinking, yeah, this is really cool. And my boss is going, get them out of here. And then, you know, sort of brought back to reality, oh, so I stood up and a mate of mine who used to be in the Paris was working with me and, you know, he started piling into these people. And I walked up to this guy and I said, look, mate, I'm really sorry about this. I agree with everything you said, but I've got to get you out of here. And fair dues to him, because it could have been really awkward and you know, sort of like pushed me into a position where I had to manhandle him. And he said, no, it's okay, mate, you just walk out with me, we'll walk out together. So I sort of walked out pretending to manhandle this guy out, and he walked out banging his drum. And that was when I realised that if you need security in London, you must be up to no good, you know. So that was the end of my security career. And at the same time, you know, I was watching all these news stories come back from Iraq, watching all these stories about what the British and the American military was up to out there, and I started to get really angry because all the stories I was seeing on the media didn't match up to what my own experiences had told me. And I was thinking, was I in some different conflict, or you know, some different war zone, or you know, how comes none of this matches? And there were politicians on the TV making all these statements about Iraq. I think the angriest I got was when Tony Blair was on a chat show, and he was asked, "Oh, you know, do you think people would judge you about the war in Iraq?" And you know, he said, "Oh, God will judge me." You know, I remember getting really angry about that. And as I got more and more angry about this, I met a guy called Brian Hall down at Parliament Square, and he'd been down there he must have been there for 10 years at that point, or 6 years. And I asked him what he was doing, and he told me about how he'd been there since before the Iraq War, protesting about the sanctions against Iraq and how that had affected the children. And I said, "Oh, that's really interesting." I said, "Oh, can I help you out at all?" And he said, "Oh, can you come and look after my stuff while I sleep?" And it was quite similar to being in the army, turn up there in the dark, sit in the cold, nothing happens. But I started to meet people who were in this anti-war movement, this stop the war movement, and other people, you know, involved in all sorts of other groups, you know, pacifists and CND and people like that. And I hadn't heard of any of these people before, you know. People have often talked to me afterwards, they talk about this 1 million person march, you know, and when I was in the military, I don't think any of us really took any notice of that, you know. We didn't really take any notice of any opposition to the war in Iraq. We just wanted to go there, you know, any excuse. We didn't really care if there were weapons of mass destruction or not. You know, as long as we got to go there. But, you know, this meeting these radical people, these anti-war people, and also feeling this great anger about how the war was being represented. And I felt this obligation as well, almost like this duty to try and tell people back home what was really going on. And I suppose you could describe about what I was about to do as a classic case of whistleblowing. And so I started to speak in public. Started to speak in public on platforms like this, started to speak in front of the media, about my experiences in Iraq, about what was going on out there. And this kind of went on, you know, and I'd get pulled in by the MOD every now and again, or asked to go for an interview, you know, "What the fuck are you doing? You need to keep shut up, stop going on the TV." And there was a sort of like to and fro. Until in 2008, the British government were talking about their involvement in, and they were trying to make out that there was this, you know, this tiny involvement, that our only involvement was letting the Americans use this island, Diego Garcia. And it was at that point that the penny dropped for me, you know, about what I'd been involved in. And that actually a lot of the people who'd ended up in Abu Ghraib, Camp Nama, Balad, you know, and earlier on in the war on terror, people who'd end up in Guantanamo, people who'd end up in Bagram, they'd been detained by British soldiers. And I knew that because everybody I detained went into American custody. And so I made a statement about this, about how Britain was involved in this, and you couldn't get much more involved than taking these people out of their homes in the first place. You know, it's like saying that the coal miner down the mine isn't involved in producing coal. You know, it was pretty straightforward to me. Anyway, as a result of this, that was a step too far for the Ministry of Defence, and I was taken to the High Court in a secret trial, given a lifetime injunction which says that I must not tell you anything I know as a result of my time in Special Forces. And that should have been the end of the story, you know. I got really depressed after that. I still believed in the legal system in this country, didn't realise that basically it was just a case of the highest bidder. And I got really depressed. Part of that was because I think part of the way I was dealing with what I was involved in Iraq was by speaking in public, you know, trying to right a wrong. You know, I'd been involved in that, but at least I was trying to put something right. But this route I'd taken had come to a dead end, and it didn't look like there was any way through. I felt very isolated. I didn't know of any other soldiers who'd gone through a similar process or who thought or felt the same as me. And that was the end of my days as a whistleblower, really, and it's only recently that I come to understood what a whistleblower actually is. And a mate of mine told me this story, and it's basically this, is that a group of people, they come across a river, and there's a load of dead bodies floating down the river. And the first reaction of the first group is to run off and phone for an ambulance, or maybe get in touch with their MP, or phone the police. All sorts of different reactions like that. And what they're doing is, they think or believe that by telling the authorities about this problem, that the authorities will do something about it. And that's what a whistleblower believes, whether it's Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden. You know, they believe that by putting this information out there, somehow that's going to change the situation. The next group of people, they jump in the water with the dead bodies and the half-dead bodies, and they try pulling them out. It's like, we've got to help these people. And that's the reaction of the charities. Royal British Legion, Help for Heroes. People who go out to Iraq and try and offer humanitarian aid, that's a charity response to take the bodies out. But there's another reaction. And that reaction is to go up river and confront the people throwing the bodies in. And so the whistleblowing is that first part. And I suppose Veterans for Peace and, you know, how we've organised is the third part. Because actually, when you go up the river and confront the people who are throwing the bodies in, it turns out that they're exactly the same people that the whistleblowers are trying to speak to. I went through a period where, because I felt so isolated and I didn't have an outlet for anything, I started to suffer quite severely with the sort of effects of what the military would call post-traumatic stress disorder, which what a lot of veterans would just call post-traumatic stress, or I heard another description in the Civil War. It was called soldier's heart, which actually I think is a much more valid term for it, because I think that post-traumatic stress disorder is actually a human reaction to an inhuman thing, and that if you're not affected by these conflicts in some way, you must in some ways be inhuman, you know. And it was at that time I was going in and out of sort of veterans counselling and, you know, combat stress and all these institutions. I started to meet other veterans, a lot of other veterans, and it turned out that actually a lot of veterans felt exactly the same as I did. That they weren't all pro-military. That in fact, if you sit down and listen to a veteran and get past that opening bravado, the opening 10, 15 minutes, half an hour sometimes, most of the stories they're telling are actually anti-war stories. They might not say, I'm anti-war, or, you know, I'm in the peace movement. But if you sit down and listen to a veteran, a lot of the stories are anti-war stories. And it was at this time, actually, that my dad told me a story about my granddad, this guy who me and my cousins had badgered to show the medals. And it turns out that my granddad had been in the Royal Navy for a long time before the Second World War. And he was involved in the I don't know the Navy term for it, but the sort of group that went down and hunted the Bismarck. And I think they chased, people might know the history better than me, but they chased the Bismarck across the Atlantic, cornered the Bismarck somewhere off South America, and they sank it. And when my granddad was dying 50 years later, the one thing he kept talking about, the one thing that really bothered him, that he'd never talked about for those 50 years, was how they were ordered not to get any of the guys out of the water, the German guys out of the water. They were told that these guys are not to be rescued, which went against everything that a sailor is taught, you know, about you might sink the ship, but you take the survivors out of the water. So he was affected by this, you know, and I didn't find out that story until a lot later. And I started to talk at length with veterans about their own experiences and started to realise that actually there were a lot of us that felt the same about all this. So in 2010, you know, it's a much longer story here, but post-2007, there was a sort of sea change in how the Royal British Legion, how the military interacted with society. And you can see this in manifestations like Help for Heroes and how the Royal British Legion has changed its style of campaigning. So you move from when I was a child, and I'm sure everyone in the room can remember, you know, most of the people who used to sell poppies would have been veterans in the street, old guys, maybe with medals, with a tin. And we went from that to this kind of 3-week period, which is launched by pop stars, you know, girl bands singing about sex on a stage with all these poppies coming down, and it's almost like a divorcing remembrance entirely from the context, entirely from the conflict. It's actually a complete lack of remembrance. And I was in one of these combat stress sort of counselling groups with a load of veterans, and I said to me, is anyone else pissed off about this? And it turned out that everyone was pissed off about it. So we wrote this letter sort of highlighting our objections to how this modern campaign was working. And it got into the newspapers, I think it was in the Times. And it was after this I started to think, oh, wait a minute, we could get something going here. And I started to look into how we could get a veterans organisation going. But I didn't really know how it was going to work or what we were going to call it. And I was given a talk in a bookshop one night about military recruitment and about how the military was getting into our schools. And there was a guy sat in the back, big guy, and he was nodding at everything I said. And I was thinking, wow, he's sort of, not many people do that when I'm speaking. So after they finished the talk, this guy, he was a big guy, big broad shoulders, big chin. He looked like an old American film star. And he came up to me and goes, oh, my name's Barry, I'm from San Diego, and I'm from an organisation called Veterans for Peace. Have you ever heard of us? And I thought, oh, I have heard of you guys. I met one of you guys about 5 years ago, but I hadn't really thought anything more about it. Because when I left Iraq, when I left the army, I wasn't anti-war. I was against the war in Iraq. And it took years for me to kind of move, from that sort of soldier's indoctrination and to reevaluate all that history I'd read and reevaluate all those other wars. And it was at that time in 2011 that suddenly Veterans for Peace started to make sense to me, and he gave keep in touch with us, and he did. And he started sending us stuff through the post. And so we started meeting. And it wasn't long, maybe 6 months after that we actually got a group of guys off the ground. It started pretty small. It was just one or two of us meeting up for protests and demos, and we were running our own stuff. I remember the Occupy movement started, so that must have been sort of October 11 at St Paul's, and a mate of mine got on the phone. He goes, Ben, there's a guy down here speaking on the steps of St Paul's in a military uniform. I was going, grab hold of that man, do not let him go anywhere, I'll be down. And I sort of raced down there from Tottenham, and there's this young kid, he must have been 23, like slim little guy, and he was telling it to the crowd, and I took him over to one side. Are you a veteran? He goes, yeah, I've just got out of Scots Guards, I said, have you heard of Veterans for Peace? Of course you haven't. I said, do you want to join? He goes, well, what does it mean? I sort of read out this statement to him. He goes, yeah, I'll join that. So I took his jacket home that night and stitched the badge on, to make sure he would join. And then I went back down to Occupy all the time, and I was buying him cigarettes and, getting him a meal. The guy had no money, just trying to make his time a bit easier down there. And me and him started to organise our own stuff. And then other people started to join, and we started to run things. And, I suppose, moving on, so who's in Veterans for Peace? Is it just a bunch of disgruntled Iraq veterans, these kids who, probably pampered a bit too much when they were boys, No, it's not. Our oldest veteran, Jim Radford, D-Day veteran. He was at D-Day on one of the landing crafts in 1944. We've got guys who served in Malaya in 1948, 49, 50. Aden, Dhofar, Northern Ireland in the early 70s. Tonight we've got guys who served in West Germany, Gulf War, Northern Ireland in the 70s, Afghanistan. That their government was getting involved in Central America. We took that statement of purpose and sort of boiled it down and thought, right, what does this mean? And we come up with three sort of areas for us to work in. And the first area we work in is education. Our children, I've got 3 children, our children are subjugated to an immense amount of propaganda from the military, from the media, from our politicians, and it's pro-war, pro-military propaganda. Now, the military and our government isn't looking to recruit every child into the military. They don't need many people. I think actually they probably need less than 10,000 people a year to join the military to keep the numbers ticking over. So what's the purpose of all this propaganda if they don't need to recruit that many people? Well, the purpose is to win over the hearts and minds of the whole population, people who will never go anywhere near the military, to the idea that the military are a noble organisation, that we fight wars for noble causes, and that we're the good guys. And that also, war is the only solution. The military is the only solution. And this is disturbing. This is disturbing for me, because I don't believe that. So we go into schools and we tell children about our own experiences. We tell children about what happened to us in military training. We tell children about what it was like serving in the army and what our war experiences were like. And we don't tell children don't join the army, we just tell them our own experiences. We're quite honest, tell them that this is one person's perspective. A lot of the time the children in the class have got uncles or grandfathers in the military or brothers even. And we say to them, that everyone has got a different experience in the military, but this is ours. But we do think it's important to challenge that idea that the military is the only solution to our problems. And if you think about it, it pervades our whole society. We're not even talking about military problems. If there's a riot in Tottenham, there are huge numbers of society who are advocating for the troops to be put onto the streets. Foot and mouth, get the troops out. Fire brigade strike, get the troops out. Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, get the troops out. Our society thinks in military terms, thinks in military solutions. The other part of our work you could title resistance. An example of this, it's resistance to war and militarism in its manifestations, or how it manifests in our society. And at present we're involved with other organisations, CND, Campaign Against the Arms Trade, Stop the War Coalition, a whole load of the Quakers, Pax Christi, in trying to stop the renewal of Trident nuclear weapons. This weekend we had about 15 of our guys at the Trident demo down in London. We also incorporate that into our education work. When we go into schools, we talk about Trident. Britain is about to breach the Non-Proliferation Treaty by renewing our Trident missiles. And they're also about to spend 100 billion quid on this. At a time when we've been told there's no money for the NHS, there's no money to combat climate change, that we've been told it's okay to spend 100 billion quid on Trident. So that's an example of the resistance we carry out. We also support people who are resisting the military. Not long after we set up Veterans for Peace, a young Navy medic called Mike Lyons. Now, Mike wasn't opposed to this idea, but he's a fairly clever guy, so he decided to look into what the war in Afghanistan was about. And it just so happened that WikiLeaks had released the Afghan war diaries at that time. So Mike was at home reading these Afghan war diaries every night. And the diaries were telling him things, and bearing in mind the diaries were written by the Americans. They're military reports, straight from the horse's mouth, about destruction of people's houses, torturing people, killing civilians. And this wasn't what he was being told by the military. Anyway, Mike decided that he wasn't going to go to Afghanistan. He applied for conscience objector status. It was all going well until he went to see the chaplain. They don't have padres in the Navy, they have chaplains. And the chaplain wrote a report to his commanding officer saying, because Mike Lyons has no faith, he cannot possibly have a moral objection to the war in Afghanistan. As a result of that, Mike's conscience objector status was denied. Mike was sent to carry out rifle training to deploy to Afghanistan, and he thought, no, I'm a conscience objector, I'm not going to pick up that rifle. And as a result, he was found guilty of disobeying a direct order, given 9 months in Colchester prison. Veterans for Peace had just set up at the time, and we decided this is someone we should be supporting. So we started to raise money for his wife, who was receiving no money at the time. When Mike was in prison, his pay was stopped. We sent her money so that she could go up and see him. We also organised vigils outside of the prison to show Mike that we thought what he'd done was the right thing, he'd done the right thing. And we also went in to visit Mike to tell him that what he'd done was the right thing. And Mike, after he left prison, he joined Veterans for Peace. So that's another example of how we help resistors. And the last sort of heading of our work is solidarity. And we're involved in work at the minute. We're in solidarity with communities and individuals, groups of people who've been affected by the British military. And one of those sections of society ain't too far from here. We've just started a project. We've got a VFP branch in Belfast. And last October, Les and myself and 6 other veterans travelled back to Northern Ireland to meet with former IRA volunteers, to meet with the families of Bloody Sunday, not with an agenda, but just to reach out to those people. We wanted to understand them. We wanted to understand what it was like to be a family member of someone killed by the British military. We wanted to understand what would push someone in to join the IRA. We also met with Joe Berry and Pat McGee, Pat McGee was the guy responsible for killing Joe Berry's father at the Brighton bombing. So that's part of our work, is to reach out to these groups that have been affected by the British military, to try and come to some sort of understanding, to try and build some sort of bridge between people who would be considered maybe by outsiders as enemies. And that work continues. We're going back to Ireland in February to show some films that we've made. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there and maybe open it up to questions. We've also got, I think Tan has had to leave to get his train, but we've got Mike Nelson, who served with the Royal Signals in the Gulf War. We've got Les Gibbons, who served with the Royal Marines in South Armagh in the late 70s. And we've got Carl Hemming, one of our youngest members, who served as a ring armourer with the infantry in Afghanistan just fairly recently. So I think the mic is going to be coming round. You can address the question to me or any of the other guys.